By the winter of 1941, war had been raging across Europe, Asia and Africa for over 2 years. Millions were living in fear throughout occupied Europe, while many were suffering unimaginable atrocities in concentration and prison camps. In Africa, fighting continued between the Allies and Hitler's Axis powers, while in China, terror bombings by the Japanese continued to ravage the vast nation. Meanwhile, Britain had survived the onslaught of German bombs rained down upon them during the Blitz, and taking advantage of some much-needed respite, Winston Churchill and the British people looked on as Hitler turned his attention to the Eastern Front and the Soviets. While it seemed that the entire world was falling under the dark shadow of conflict, the United States of America had also been watching events unfold from afar. Despite the fact that preparations had been underway to join the Allies in battle for some time, it wasn't until December 1941 that events drew President Roosevelt and the American people into the war. When Japanese bombers swarmed above Pearl Harbor, unleashing a devastatingly violent attack, thousands of servicemen were killed as the US naval fleet based there was decimated. The reaction from Washington was swift, and the empire of the rising sun had woken a sleeping giant, opening a new chapter in the history of the Second World War.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
From the drama of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor to the battles in the jungles and islands of the Pacific, this program reveals the reasons behind America's late entry into the fight against the Axis powers, and how their economic and military strength shone a ray of hope on those fighting desperately for freedom all around the world. The United States had long been known as the land of plenty, and from rivers glistening with gold deposits to vast territories rich in natural resources where great towering cities exuded new wealth, the country had boasted its affluence from coast to coast. For many flooding into America as immigrants from overseas, the USA was seen as a place where dreams really could come true. But despite an abundance of jobs, land and resources, after the First World War, even the mighty home of the free had its problems. When the Wall Street crash struck in 1929, it dealt a devastating blow to the once booming economy, and as queues of poverty-stricken folk seeking work began to form on the streets, other nations were soon to follow the USA into a dark period of turmoil as the world faced the desperate days of the Great Depression. The economic problems were far-reaching, and across the Atlantic in Europe, Germany, still reeling from having to pay reparations after being defeated in the First World War, was hit particularly hard. Inflation rocketed, and as the economy froze, millions were made bankrupt. The German nation was plunged into poverty, and a discontented population was attracted to the promises of the Nazi Party, led by the fervently patriotic Adolf Hitler, who vowed to create a new age of wealth and affluence. His rousing speeches soon began to captivate the German people, and Hitler quickly rose to a position of unassailable power. In 1936, the Nazi dictator proved he was a man of his word. when he ordered Nazi troops to march into the Rhineland, territory seized from Germany after World War I, he was able to secure precious raw materials to feed his empire-building ambitions. Within 3 years, Hitler's thirst for power and dominance had seen Nazi troops dispatched further afield. But when, on September 1st, 1939, the Germans stormed into Poland, it meant the start of a Second World War. While nations fell to Hitler, toppling like dominoes across Europe as the Nazis pushed further west, far across the world in the Eastern Pacific, the Japanese were watching the Western empires crumble. Their tiny island kingdom had also been affected by the depression engulfing the world, and following the crash of 1929, Japanese incomes had dropped by 2/3, and banks had foreclosed on many businesses. As the value of the yen continued to fall, with few natural resources of its own, Japan had faced a crisis on the scale of Germany, and just like the Germans, the Japanese had started to fight for their survival. Right-wing propagandists began pressing for the invasion of Manchuria in eastern China to ensure a supply of raw materials to feed the economy, and in 1931, the Imperial Army of Japan took their first steps towards creating a great Eastern Empire. While the leader of the Chinese National Front, Chiang Kai-shek, faced the invading Japanese, by 1937, the battles had escalated into a brutal campaign to conquer the rest of China. As 1938 drew to a close, Japan had within its grasp 9/10 of the nation's railway system and controlled the entire coastline of China. Chinese cities had also been devastated by Japanese terror bombings, leaving a trail of horror in their wake. Soon, stories of massacres and atrocities perpetrated by the Japanese in China began to reach the West. After more than 5,000 civilians were killed at Chongqing in May 1939, America imposed its first economic sanctions on Japan. On a global scale, these were indeed dark days, as Nazi and Japanese expansionism began to shatter the status quo. And although America had passed a policy of non-intervention, it was becoming increasingly difficult to sit by and watch the emerging powers of Germany and Japan claim one victory after another. Matters came to a head when Japan sealed its alliance with Adolf Hitler and the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini in the Tripartite Pact of September 1940. It was clear to the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt that America's policy of neutrality and non-intervention may not be sustainable, and he had a stark warning for the people of the US. He said, "We are determined to keep out of war, yet we cannot insure ourselves against the disastrous effects of war and the dangers of involvement." American military and financial aid to China was increased. By October 1940, the Selective Training and Service Act was passed by Congress to bolster the armed forces. It was the first peacetime conscription that had ever taken place in the country, as all males aged between 21 and 36 could be called up for military service for 12 months. But if war was declared, they would have to serve their country for the duration of the conflict. With American territories such as the Philippines and Guam to safeguard in the Pacific, a program was embarked upon to increase military presence in the area. With the influx of men into the American forces during the next year, further moves were made by the US to halt Japanese expansionism. In the summer of 1941, the White House decided to freeze Japanese assets so they could no longer purchase oil in America. With 80% of their oil imports being met by the United States, this was disastrous news for the Japanese. Emperor Hirohito was informed that the nation's oil stockpiles would be completely depleted within 2 years, which in turn of course meant that the Japanese military machine would no longer be able to function. Matters deteriorated for the Japanese yet again when they saw British Prime Minister Winston Churchill meet America's President Roosevelt on a warship anchored off Newfoundland to discuss the situation in Europe and the Pacific in August 1941. This gave rise to the treaty known as the Atlantic Charter and advocated freedom from want and fear, the disarmament of aggressor nations, and stated that all people had a right to self-determination. To the West, this was a blueprint for the brave new world that the Allies prayed would emerge after the war had ended. But to the Japanese, it was a blueprint for Anglo-American world domination, and even a formal declaration of war couldn't have been more provocative. With the future looking increasingly dire for Japan, at an imperial conference in Tokyo on September 6, 1941, it was decided that unless America agreed to withdraw all political and economic support for the Chinese nationalist government and to lift their economic and oil embargoes on Japan, negotiations with the country would come to a close. The deadline given was for mid-October, and in the meantime, the Imperial Army began to prepare their battle plan. They were already well placed to launch attacks on the colonies of the British, Dutch and the Americans, having already invaded French Indochina. From here, the military could occupy territories rich in raw materials, such as tin and rubber, along with many other commodities. But most important of all, from here they were within easy reach of a rich and sustainable oil supply. With war looming on the horizon, the people of Japan were encouraged to support a battle with the West, which was glorified as a fight for the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. It was an enterprise that intended to free the people of Southeast Asia and China from Western domination. They would be under the protection of Japan, which would reign with justice and morality throughout a new kingdom. But although the principles of the co-prosperity sphere appeared to be noble and just, once the Pacific War began, the reality would be very different. Civilians throughout the East would discover that Japanese brutality was considerably worse than Western imperialism, which had for so long dominated their countries, and the horrors of war would soon destroy any illusions that Japan's intentions were honourable. With future battle plans ever closer, interestingly, not everyone in Tokyo was keen to rush into a war. The Prime Minister of Japan, Fumimaro Konoe, had at one time supported the notion of the co-prosperity sphere. But as the conflict continued in China, he feared that a war on two fronts would be impossible to win, and was therefore keen to continue negotiations with the United States. He pressed for a summit meeting with President Roosevelt to discuss the issues and to keep the pro-war factions in Japan at bay until a peaceful solution could be found. But Roosevelt refused to meet until Japan had left China. Meanwhile, for the Japanese military, the concept of retreat could not even be considered, and would forever be perceived as a humiliating stain on the glory of their empire. And as oil supplies gradually dwindled, the the October deadline approached, it looked unlikely that a compromise would be reached. Anxious to begin their conquests of territories across the Pacific, the Japanese military machine once again pressed for war, and at a cabinet meeting on October the 14th, the army minister Hideki Tojo announced that negotiations had failed and the deadline for an agreement had passed. Nothing more could be done to avert going to war with the West, and Konoe, frustrated with his failure to negotiate a settlement, saw no other option but to resign. On October the 18th, as the warmongering General Tojo replaced Konoe and the militarists assumed total control of Japan, the time for negotiating was over and the battle was about to begin. Throughout history, the Japanese were renowned for their fierce fighting and had once been led by samurai warriors who instilled the idea of bushido, or freedom from fear, in their soldiers. A true Japanese warrior should have no fear of death, pain, or defeat, and no regard for himself, with his only purpose being to serve his master. But even with this extraordinary fearlessness instilled in the population, the fight ahead was going to be challenging. The United States had built up immense naval fleets and armies and would be a formidable opponent. The admiral of the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, was well aware of what the country was up against and knew that to begin a war with America, the Imperial Army would have to do a great deal more than simply seize their outposts. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University, as well as spending time serving as a naval attaché in America. He was one of the few Japanese commanders who really understood the immense naval power of the USA, and he told his government in no uncertain terms what was required. It is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, or even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. But despite his well-founded concerns about picking a fight with such a powerful nation as America, Yamamoto was loyal to his empire and dutifully began searching for the best way to overcome the US Navy. In October 1940, he'd observed the British bombard the Italian fleet based at Taranto with torpedoes, especially developed to work in the shallow water of the Italian Bay. It was the first attack of its kind and had proved an inspiration to the Japanese admiral. He realised that rather than waiting for the American destroyers to come to the Pacific, the planes of Imperial Japan could be mobilised for a surprise strike on the American fleet, crippling it before it could set sail for the Pacific theatre of war. In the spring of 1941, Japanese carrier pilots began training in the special tactics that would be essential in the attack plan, which would target Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. By the autumn, as Tojo took on the role of Prime Minister, Yamamoto saw that there was now no turning back. At the beginning of November, he assigned Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commander of the mission and set a date for the planned attack, December the 7th, 1941. Earlier, back in Washington, President Roosevelt was concerned about deteriorating relations with Japan and the risk this posed to American territory in the Pacific, and had elected to move the American fleet from its base in California to Hawaii, where it would be closer to the Pacific arena. Here, on the largest island of the archipelago at Pearl Harbor, the sailors soaked up the sun and enjoyed the beaches, with little idea that they were far closer to the troubles brewing overseas than they could possibly have imagined. But while the sailors enjoyed their Hawaiian paradise, Western intelligence had made some disturbing discoveries. On November the 18th, 1941, the US Navy cracked a secret code, enabling them to decipher information sent to the Japanese ambassadors in Washington. It revealed that in the event of an emergency, coded warnings would be added to the middle of the daily Japanese news broadcast. North wind, cloudy, would mean war with the Soviet Union. West wind, clear, meant war with Britain and its colonies. And east wind, rain, represented war with the United States. If Japanese delegates on foreign soil heard this weather report, they were ordered to destroy all code papers. While intelligence was on full alert, listening out for the messages which would give them early warning of an attack, the ships that would make up the Pearl Harbor attack fleet had begun to disappear from Japan's home waters. They were heading for their rendezvous point in the freezing Kurile Islands to the north of Japan. But although shipping movements were being monitored, Western intelligence still only suspected the attack on the Pacific and had little idea of the terrible danger the US naval fleet at Pearl Harbor was in. Meanwhile, the charade of diplomacy continued between Japan and America, and on November the 20th, the Japanese ambassador to the United States, Nomura, presented Japan's final ultimatum to the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, demanding a resumption of oil supplies to Japan and the cessation of aid to China. Hull refused to comply and once more demanded that all Japanese troops be withdrawn from China. With negotiations coming to a close, on November the 26th, 1941, the Japanese task force, comprising of 6 aircraft carriers accompanied by 24 supporting vessels, departed from Tankan Bay in the Kurile Islands in the strictest secrecy. Keeping radio silence to avoid detection, they crossed the North Pacific, avoiding the normal shipping lanes as they headed towards their destination 200 miles northwest of Hawaii. It was from here that the attack on Pearl Harbor would be launched. Having received Cordell Hull's reply on December the 1st, the Japanese Emperor Hirohito held an imperial meeting to announce that the decision to go to war with America had been taken and that the time for negotiation was over. With Japan now fully committed to war, the next day Admiral Yamamoto sent a coded message from his base in Hiroshima to Vice Admiral Nagumo, the commander of the task force, ordering him to launch the attack on December the 7th. With intelligence services desperately deciphering communications around the globe, suddenly Japanese diplomats in Washington, London, Manila, Hong Kong and Singapore were ordered to burn their codes. This not only meant that diplomatic relations had been severed, but war was about to begin. And for the Allies, the all-important question was where. While the British and Americans watched for the first signs of belligerence from the Far East, in Nazi Germany, officials were jubilant about the prospect of a Japanese attack on Allied territory. The German Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop had assured the Japanese ambassador in Berlin that Hitler would support its tripartite pact ally and declare war as soon as Japan went to war with the United States. Tokyo had in turn informed Germany that the time of this war may come quicker than anyone dreams. While Roosevelt was well aware that a peaceful conclusion to negotiations between Japan and America looked more tenuous by the day, he could hardly have imagined that a full-scale airborne attack was just a week away. Unaware of the task force lining up close to Hawaii, on December the 6th, the American president made a final appeal for peace to the Emperor Hirohito. Ominously, there was no reply, but later that day, US intelligence intercepted a 14-part Japanese message and deciphered the first 13 parts. They revealed that Secretary of State Hull's offer had been rejected, but the message was incomplete, and it wasn't until the next day that the crucial 14th part actually arrived. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, life went on as normal. American sailors were ashore, enjoying their tropical paradise as they played football or golf. And on the night of December the 6th, as sailors relaxed in the bars and clubs, many were dancing to the sounds of the Navy's musicians in a Battle of the Fleet dance bands. Staying up until the early hours, few would be prepared for the onslaught that lay ahead. But as night gave way to day, the first warning signs were breaking over the horizon. At 4:50 a.m. on Sunday, December the 7th, Japanese midget submarines stealthily entered through the harbour gates, but though they were spotted, no general alarm was given. Back in Washington, the tension was building as General George C. Marshall, Roosevelt's military advisor, had received the decoded 14th part of the message from Tokyo. It confirmed that negotiations with Japan had ended, and realizing the potential implications, the US War Department immediately sent an alert to Pearl Harbor. But problems with radio communications would delay the message, and tragically, the vital warning would arrive too late. While Washington was aware that hostilities were about to commence, on the other side of the Pacific, events were gathering pace as Japanese ships loaded with 5,000 troops from the war-torn battlefields of China approached British-controlled Malaya. Soon soldiers were storming onto the beaches and onto Allied territory, and the war on the West had begun. While the fury of the Japanese military was unleashed in the Pacific, radio transmissions between the Japanese carrier fleet near Hawaii and Tokyo ceased, and at 6:15 a.m., Vice Admiral Nagumo gave the order to release the planes. As the aircraft carriers pitched and rolled on the stormy seas, the first wave of 183 fighters, bombers and torpedo planes, commanded by Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, took to the sky. The vast formation included bombers which would target the battleships and aircraft carriers, followed by dive bombers to attack the land-based aircraft and hangars at Ford Island and Wheeler Field. Then came the Japanese fighter aircraft, assigned the task of destroying the planes on the airfields before they could take off and defend the harbour. Using music from a Honolulu radio station as a guiding beam to navigate, the enemy planes began to close in on their target. Meanwhile, at the Hawaiian naval base, the alarm still hadn't been raised, and people were either asleep or enjoying the tranquility of a lazy Sunday morning. Then, to the amazement of those at the harbour, just before 8 a.m, the first Japanese assault wave darkened the skies and the calm was shattered. Commander Logan C. Ramsey at the command center on Ford Island sounded the alert. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. While the Japanese fighter planes began to swoop over Hickam and Wheeler airfields, rallying to the battle cries of Commander Fuchida. The Americans, believing there was no imminent threat, had made little effort to prepare themselves for attack. The aircraft were neatly parked out in the open, wingtip to wingtip. Ammunition lockers were locked, and even the guns that could have provided some protection against the aerial onslaught were unmanned. As showers of bombs were released onto the airfields below, the Japanese could barely believe their luck. The element of surprise, so crucial to Yamamoto's plan, could not have been greater. There weren't even any torpedo nets to protect the American battleships, and as waves of bombers began to close in on the fleet, the torpedoes, developed to slice through the shallow depths of Pearl Harbor, devastated one target after the other. Of the more than 90 ships at anchor in Pearl Harbor, the main objective of the Japanese had been to strike the vessels moored on Battleship Row along the southeast shore of Ford Island. As tornadoes screamed through the air, hitting their targets with precision, the men aboard awoke to a tumult of smoke, fire, and deafening explosions. Battleships had little chance to defend themselves, and within the first minutes of the attack, all of the 7 anchored along the shore had been bombed or torpedoed. 2 sank, while the USS Arizona exploded in a giant ball of flames after an armor-piercing shell ignited the ship's forward ammunition magazine. Although a lucky few were able to jump overboard and swim to safety, as the ship was engulfed in flames, over 1,000 crewmen were killed, including one of the bands that had competed the night before. It was the greatest loss of life on any ship that day, and the casualties of the USS Arizona amounted to half the total number of Americans killed at Pearl Harbor. As the naval base was thrown into pandemonium, 30 minutes after the first attack, there was a short lull in the furious onslaught before a second wave of Japanese planes appeared over the harbour. By now, all around Pearl Harbor, civilians who had first thought the explosions were part of military maneuvers quickly became aware that they were under attack. The element of surprise had passed, however, and the US troops were now well aware of what they were facing. Anti-aircraft fire began to fight off the attacks, and some sailors even turned to machine guns and pistols as they battled desperately against the hail of missiles from the sky. Many heroes would emerge on this historical day, and one of those who fought bravely to defend the naval base was Doris Miller, a mess attendant aboard the USS West Virginia. Despite having no training, he seized one of the anti-aircraft guns and began firing at Japanese planes until there was no ammunition left. But despite the bravery of Miller and all those fighting off the onslaught, the casualties suffered by Nagumo's pilots would be few compared to the devastating losses of the Americans. By 10 a.m, as the skies over the Hawaiian harbour fell silent 2 hours after the initial attack had begun, a trail of destruction lay around Pearl Harbor. As nurses and doctors rushed to tend the wounded, it was clear that the US fleet had been dealt a devastating blow. Over 2,400 Americans had been killed, including a number of civilians. Over 21 ships had been sunk or disabled, and almost 200 aircraft were destroyed, while over 150 were damaged as they stood on the ground. Virtually none had been able to take off to defend the base. The US could well have suffered much greater losses had Nagumo's junior officers had their way. When the second wave of planes returned from Hawaii, they'd pressed for a third wave of attacks to destroy the American fleet's repair capabilities and the vast oil reserves that remained untouched. But with fuel running low and the risk of American bombers retaliating, Admiral Yamamoto was reluctant to incur further losses and had ordered the ships to turn around and head for home. It was a decision that would cost Japan dearly, as although the scene at Pearl Harbor was one of utter devastation, most of the ships on Battleship Row would be miraculously salvaged and eventually rejoin the battle against Japan in the Pacific theatre of war. As well as the failure to order a third strike, there was also another blow to Yamamoto's plan, as 3 US Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers, Lexington, Enterprise and Saratoga, were not in the port during the raid. The USS Enterprise, under the commander of Admiral Bill Halsey, had been delivering planes to Wake Island and was 250 miles west of Hawaii. Halsey himself was furious when news of the attack reached him, and after vowing to avenge the Americans who died that day, he spent the next 3 years pursuing the Japanese around the Pacific. Far away in Washington, news of the attack at Pearl Harbor had reached Roosevelt and the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. Yamamoto had wanted to abide by the military laws of engagement, giving notice of an attack, and had ordered the Japanese ambassadors to take a message saying negotiations had failed to the White House by 1 p.m. This would mean 7 a.m. in Hawaii, giving a full hour's notice. The message arrived 1 hour late, however, and as Envoy Nomura presented the formal document, the planes were already swarming above the Hawaiian naval base. Secretary of State Hull was furious and announced, "In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen such a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehood and distortion." Soon, the American public joined the Secretary of State in his fury as they heard of the sneak attack on radio bulletins, with many popular Sunday afternoon entertainment programs being interrupted to announce news of the tragic events at Pearl Harbor. The news stunned and angered America, but finally the nation was united behind the president, and the United States was ready to go to war. On December the 8th, 1941, as crowds gathered outside the White House, the moment the Allies had been waiting for had come. President Roosevelt made an address, which was broadcast around the world, and the global conflict was now truly underway.
That we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us.
The American Senate was unanimous in its decision to go to war with Japan, and a determination to avenge the attack on Pearl Harbor swept far and wide across the whole of the USA. The anti-war and isolationist movement collapsed. Even President Roosevelt's fiercest critic, Charles Lindbergh, declared, "Our country has been attacked by force of arms, and by force of arms we must retaliate." Recruiting stations were jammed with a surge of volunteers, inspired by the words of the president. And as the country rushed to mobilize troops, soon news of Japanese aggression and Roosevelt's declaration of war made a dramatic impact on the battles raging in Europe. On the Eastern Front, the Nazi troops advancing on Moscow were battling against Stalin's Red Army, which fought fiercely to defend the capital. With temperatures plunging below freezing, thousands of Germans were falling victim to the bitter Russian winter. For Adolf Hitler, it was far from being an ideal moment to be drawn into conflict with another nation, especially one as powerful as the United States. Nonetheless, on December the 11th, 1940, Adolf Hitler honoured his tripartite agreement with Japan and declared war on America. Speaking out at the Reichstag in Berlin, he furiously insulted President Roosevelt and blamed him for the outbreak of war in 1939 and of even plotting to invade Germany. Confident of the backing of Imperial Japan, he boldly announced that Germany could never lose a war with an ally that hadn't been conquered in 3,000 years, which the Japanese so proudly boasted. The hopes of the Nazi leader were at the very least naive, and his rash decision to take up arms against the United States would ultimately see his hopes of a 1,000-year Reich crushed and destroyed. While Germany remained apprehensive about Hitler's decision, the third member of the Axis, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, also declared war on America, standing proudly on the balcony over the Piazza Venezia in Rome. As the crowd cheered, he pledged that the powers of the Pact of Steel were determined to win. And as the so-called Axis powers of Japan, Germany and Italy united against America, Britain, France and their allies, the world had entered a truly global and very dangerous conflict. For the British, who'd been struggling against the might and terror of the Nazi onslaught for over 2 years, there was immense relief at the news that America had joined the war. Finally, there was a real possibility that the Allies could defeat the Axis, and the borders of Europe could be rebuilt once more. There can be no doubt that the news was met with joy by those in occupied Europe. But as the people of Britain breathed a huge sigh of relief, there was now another enemy to face. And while Japanese troops began their Pacific advance, the outposts of the British Empire were under serious threat. After the Japanese invasion of Malaya, the Royal Navy had dispatched the valuable battle cruisers HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales from Singapore to offer support. However, the Japanese intercepted the advance, and on December the 10th, an air attack destroyed and sank both ships. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill received the unhappy news, and his concern was evident when he said, "Over this vast expanse of water, Japan is supreme, and we everywhere are weak and naked." There was little doubt that the situation was grave for the future of the British Empire, and as the Japanese marched unchallenged across Malaya, soon more outposts were under attack. On December the 11th, the Japanese invaded the British territory of Burma from their stronghold in Thailand, and 2 days later they made their way to Borneo. The news from the Far East was getting more worrying by the day, and as the relentless Japanese advanced closer to the precious outposts of Hong Kong and Singapore, Winston Churchill's concerns that the empire was swiftly slipping from Britain's grasp were now a stark and unavoidable reality. Back in the United States, President Roosevelt was equally concerned about the fate of American territory in the Far East. 9 hours after the first strike on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had begun bombing the American base in the Philippines, which would suffer even greater devastation than the fleet at Pearl Harbor. As the Japanese won the battle for control of the skies above the islands, thousands of troops began pouring onto the northern beaches and the gulfs of the western coast. The task facing the inexperienced and poorly equipped Philippine and American troops was challenging, to say the least, as they tried to defend whatever ground they could against the battle-hardy Japanese. The Philippines were of vital importance to the Japanese, and by seizing the island nation, they could prevent the Americans using it as a base of operations. But more than this, with the string of islands under their command, Imperial Japan could control all lines of communication between the Philippines and other Japanese-occupied territories in the region. This really did consolidate their position of strength while providing the perfect stepping stone to reach the Dutch East Indies. It was on Dutch territory that precious oil reserves could be found, and within weeks the Japanese would be making their advance to snatch the supplies they so desperately needed to ensure a successful campaign. For the time being, though, Japanese troops marched further inland as the American commander charged with the defense of the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur, prepared to resist with all the forces he could muster. However, as the enemy advanced on the capital Manila, the situation was looking increasingly dire. While Allied forces retreated to the peninsula of Bataan, other American outposts had already fallen to the Japanese. After an aerial bombardment on December the 8th, a large invasion force had swarmed into Guam, swiftly overcoming resistance from American personnel stationed on the island. By the new year, Wake Island would also be taken, and the United States was fast losing its Pacific foothold. As the relentless advance across Southeast Asia continued, it seemed nothing could stop the Japanese military machine. And as troops spread around the Pacific and more countries were absorbed into the new Eastern Empire, there were concerns that even India and Australia would soon come under attack from the Japanese. And all the while, as the conflict grew, Admiral Yamamoto's decision to recall the ships from Pearl Harbor before landing a third and potentially decisive blow to the US naval fleet was rapidly proving to be a grave mistake. As the smoke began to settle over Pearl Harbor, salvage operations had begun to repair and refloat the ships that had been damaged in the surprise attack. Incredibly, only the USS Arizona, Utah, and Oklahoma were beyond repair, while the rest of the fleet would soon be ready to rejoin the battle in the Pacific, reclaiming territory that was being lost to the Japanese, while exacting revenge for those Americans who'd died on that fateful day. But as the ships were hauled from the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, questions were still being asked back in America. Why had the commanders at the naval base not been better prepared? Scapegoats were soon found, and the commander of the US military in Hawaii, Walter Short, along with the commander-in-chief of the US Pacific Fleet, Husband E. Kimmel, were demoted and blamed for the lack of an adequate defense plan to counter the Japanese attack with. On December the 17th, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz took over as commander of the fleet, and his role in the Pacific War would prove crucial for the Allies, and awards were presented to those who displayed great personal bravery during the attack on Pearl Harbor. The decorated included Doris Miller, who became the first African American to be awarded the Navy Cross, as the Allied leaders began planning their next move in the fight against the Axis powers. On December the 22nd, 1941, Winston Churchill flew to Washington to attend the Arcadia Conference and discuss strategies with President Roosevelt. The situation in the Pacific was deteriorating by the day, and just as the Prime Minister had feared, the Japanese were now marching on Hong Kong. Despite the domestic pressure to avenge the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the outposts falling into Japanese hands in the Pacific, the US government believed other issues needed to be dealt with first. The main priority was to defeat Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, and after Hitler's declaration of war on the United States in the days following Pearl Harbor, such a course of action became more politically acceptable. Churchill would remain at the White House until January, but while strategies were perfected and the weeks passed, the people living and fighting in the Pacific were all too aware of the terror that the Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere was beginning to symbolize. After 17 days of resistance, the battle was lost in Hong Kong, and on Christmas Day 1941, the governor of the British outpost surrendered to the Japanese. Meanwhile, the situation in the Philippines was also deteriorating at a rapid pace, and just one day after Hong Kong surrendered, Manila was declared an open city. As 1941 drew to a close, the major military powers of the world were lining up against each other in a territorial battle to the death. And over the next 4 years, armies comprising of millions would fight it out in the air, at sea, in cities, and in the jungle. For Roosevelt and Churchill, the fight was for democracy against tyranny. But as more Pacific colonies fell and more prisoners were taken, the first few months of 1942 would demonstrate that tyranny had the upper hand. However, once the vast American military machine was let loose into the theatres of operation, while GIs flooded into the Pacific and Europe, it was clear that the Second World War had truly gone global, and for the first time since the outbreak of hostilities, the Allies were in with a real chance of stopping Hitler and his axis of evil once and for all. As the Pacific struggle gathered pace, Pearl Harbor was only the beginning of a conflict in which some of the most brutal battles of the war would be fought. But while the diminutive Japanese Empire had achieved small miracles in their fight against the Western giants in the winter of 1941, Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor, was all too aware that the dreams of Imperial Japan would soon be shattered, and in point of fact, their war was already lost.